India's military failures. Are Russia's weapons bad, or are its soldiers incompetent? While France's Rafale fighter jet has recently taken a hit to its reputation, a closer look at the Indian military's arsenal shows that Russian-made equipment still makes up the overwhelming majority. However, even when India questions the quality of this equipment, Russia doesn't dare to subtly hint, as the French did, that it's the Indians' own incompetence that's embarrassing their hardware on the world stage. That's because in the arms trade between Moscow and New Delhi, India has willingly played the role of a cash cow for a full 30 years. For post-Cold War Russia, military orders from India are of strategic importance. From the collapse of the Soviet Union to the start of the war in Ukraine, India has purchased approximately $60 billion worth of weapons from Russia. This massive infusion of cash saved a large number of Russian defense companies during their most difficult period after the Soviet Union's collapse. Furthermore, the stable, long-term cooperation with India has allowed Russia's defense industry to engage in medium and long-term planning, helping it maintain its position as the world's second-largest arms exporter. The core reason Russia has such a major client in India is rooted in the Cold War, when the Soviet Union provided India with comprehensive and massive economic and military support. As early as the 1950s, Khrushchev's USSR exported entire industrial systems to India and helped establish the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. The Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation, signed in 1971, was a key factor in India's decisive victory in the Third Indo-Pakistani War. During the Cold War, the Soviets provided India with a vast array of weapons at heavily subsidized prices or even for free. This included everything from MiG-21 to MiG-29 fighter jets, An-12 to IL-76 transport aircraft, T-54 and T-72 tanks, and naval assets like Kashin-class missile destroyers. India's military was almost entirely armed with Soviet equipment. This hardware not only filled India's armories, but the production lines and technology that came with it allowed India to build its own defense industry from the ground up. On top of that, a significant portion of this aid was given free of charge, and many of the purchases India did make were financed with Soviet loans, not India's own foreign currency reserves. When the Soviet Union collapsed, India owed it over $10 billion. As the inheritor of this bill, Russia knew India wouldn't pay back the entire debt. At the same time, it didn't want to lose India as a customer. So, with a completely new mindset, Russia began to cultivate India into a one-of-a-kind sucker.
During the Cold War, the USSR supplied India with a huge number of MiG-21 fighter jets, which formed the backbone of the Indian Air Force in the 70s and 80s. But by the end of the Cold War, the aircraft was obsolete. To replace it, India initially planned to develop a domestic fighter, the Tejas. However, limited by its industrial capabilities, the Tejas program, which began in the 80s, made slow progress and still couldn't be mass-produced by the year 2000. Forced to keep the MiG-21s flying, India had to turn to Russia, the only supplier of spare parts. The Russians not only charged exorbitant prices, but also sourced many of the parts from second-hand, cannibalized Soviet-era aircraft. The unreliable quality, combined with India's poor maintenance standards, turned the MiG-21 into the flying coffin of the Indian Air Force. After the Cold War, nearly every year brought news of an Indian MiG-21 crashing during training due to mechanical failure. The plane has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Indian pilots. The MiG-21s assembled in India by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited under Russian license have an even worse record, with nearly all of them having crashed due to sudden failures in peacetime. For an air force, while planes are expensive, pilots are even more valuable. Realizing the Tejas was a distant dream, India began negotiating with Russia for a new fighter. Russia offered up its Su-30 with apparent sincerity, even signing a memorandum in October 2000 that allowed India to produce the aircraft domestically under license. The plan looked great on paper, but the execution was a complete mess. The Su-30 MKI that Russia sold to India was a model designed specifically for them by Sukhoi, based on the Su-27. But after the Soviet collapse, both Sukhoi's design capabilities and Russia's manufacturing quality were not what they used to be. The result was that the generously offered Su-30 MKI was in reality an experimental product. When the first Su-30 MKI was delivered in 2002, the Indians discovered just how unrefined the weapon was. Its custom AL-31FP engine was unreliable, the airframe required frequent overhauls, and spare parts were in short supply. All of these issues, which should have been resolved by Russia during the design and testing phases, became paid-for problems for the Indian Air Force. From 2000 to the present, India has spent over $12 billion on this aircraft, yet the core problem, its high crash rate, has never been fixed. The first Su-30 MKI crash occurred during training on April 30, 2009, and since then, there have been crashes almost every year. While the rate isn't as absurd as the MiG-21s, it's still alarming, considering India has fielded fewer than 300 of the aircraft. But while the Su-30 MKI crashes often, at least it's still in service and remains a mainline fighter for the Indian Air Force. The Indians spent the money and, at least, got a product. When it comes to the Navy, Russia's deal-making got even more audacious.
In 1994, the Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Gorshkov suffered an explosion. At the time, Russia had lost its main shipyard to Ukraine after the Soviet breakdown and had neither the money nor the technology to repair it. The carrier was left to rust. Then, during a 1998 visit to India, the Russian Prime Minister had a bright idea. He offered to gift the carrier to India. The only condition was that India had to hire Russia to repair and modernize it. India, of course, jumped at the chance to get a free aircraft carrier. Little did they know this was the beginning of a naval nightmare. Russia's real intention was to use the project to rebuild its naval industry, but they overestimated their own capabilities. In the 2004 agreement, India was to pay about $900 million for the refit. The Russian government handed the project to a shipyard that, during the Soviet era, had specialized in building submarines, not large surface ships. Unsurprisingly, they repeatedly revised the plans and the costs skyrocketed. By 2009, the price tag for the renovation alone had ballooned to $2.35 billion. When you add in the MiG-29K carrier aircraft that Russia bundled into the deal, conservative estimates put the total cost for this old carrier at over $4 billion. At the time, a brand-new British Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carrier cost around $4.5 billion. India was paying a similar price for a 20-year-old second-hand ship. They were being completely fleeced. Even worse, the carrier, renamed the INS Vikramaditya, suffered major boiler damage before it was even delivered. Since then, it has had multiple fires and to this day possesses no real combat capability. A similar tragedy occurred with the INS Chakra submarine deal. In effect, Russia has treated India as a testing ground populated by rich fools. So why hasn't this painful history led India to ditch Russian weapons? The most important reason is path dependency from the Soviet era. Soviet equipment formed the core of the Indian military, and the defense industry that the USSR helped build was centered around these systems. Even after the Soviet Union was gone, India had to hold its nose and buy Russia's overpriced and subpar services to avoid a cliff-like drop in military strength. It couldn't bring itself to make a clean break and switch to another supplier. On the other hand, while Russia gouges India on every deal, It follows a certain playbook that skillfully exploits Indian psychology, particularly their love for a bargain. In the Su-30 project, for example, although India spent over $12 billion, it received nearly 300 jets, bringing the unit cost to less than $50 million. In contrast, when India negotiated for the French Rafale in 2016, it ended up paying a staggering 7.9 billion euros for just 36 jets. Even excluding the weapon systems, the Rafale's unit price was more than double that of the Su-30. Ultimately, for India, the core requirement in military procurement isn't whether the weapons actually work well, but whether they make India look powerful. Therefore, even though the war in Ukraine and recent conflicts with Pakistan have exposed the shortcomings of Russian arms, Russia will remain India's most important equipment supplier for a long time to come.